By every reasonable measure, Viking homes should have collapsed into frozen tombs within their first winter. These weren't structures built in mild climates with occasional cold snaps. These were dwellings erected in places where winter arrived like an invading army and refused to leave for 6 months. Snow didn't gently fall and melt away. It accumulated relentlessly, piling higher each week until entire landscapes disappeared beneath white silence. Darkness wasn't a few extra hours of night. It was an oppressive blanket that swallowed the sun for weeks at a time, leaving only brief, pale glimpses of daylight that felt more like apologies than actual illumination. Wind screamed across frozen seas and barren fields with enough force to strip skin and freeze exposed flesh in minutes. This wasn't the kind of cold that made you reach for a heavier coat. This was the kind of cold that made you question whether human beings had any business existing this far north in the first place. And yet somehow, impossibly, Viking families didn't just survive inside their homes. They lived. Children grew up. Elders reached old age. Meals were prepared daily. Arguments happened over trivial matters. Life continued with a stubborn normalcy that makes absolutely no sense when you consider the circumstances. What makes this even more baffling is that Vikings didn't possess central heating, insulated windows, or any of the technology modern people consider essential for winter survival. They couldn't adjust a thermostat when temperatures dropped. They couldn't seal gaps with spray foam or call a repairman when something failed. If you placed a contemporary house in those same conditions, it would fail catastrophically within days. Pipes would burst with explosive force. Heating systems would sputter and die. Walls would weep with condensation that would freeze into destructive ice. Modern families would huddle under every blanket they owned, watching their breath form clouds indoors, desperately searching their phones for emergency services that didn't exist. Vikings, meanwhile, sat in their longhouses during blizzards that buried the world outside, and their primary concern was whether dinner was ready. This wasn't because Vikings were somehow biologically different or impervious to freezing temperatures. Frostbite damaged their flesh just as severely as it would damage yours. Hypothermia killed them just as dead. The difference was that Viking homes were designed with a level of intelligence and intentionality that most modern construction has completely forgotten. Every single element of a Viking dwelling existed for one brutally simple reason: to keep the people inside alive when everything outside wanted them dead. Winter in the Viking lands was not a calendar event that could be predicted and prepared for with a shopping trip. It was an existential threat that tested every decision a family had made throughout the year. The cold didn't arrive gradually, giving people time to adjust. It descended with shocking speed, transforming the landscape from merely harsh to actively hostile within days. Temperatures plummeted so drastically that any moisture left exposed would freeze solid overnight. Rivers that had flowed freely became impenetrable barriers of ice, thick enough to support fully loaded carts. The sea itself, that great highway of Viking exploration and trade, turned treacherous and impassable, trapping communities in isolation for months. Food sources vanished almost completely. Animals either migrated away or burrowed deep into hibernation. Plants died back to nothing. Fishing became dangerous. Every calorie consumed during winter had to have been stored, preserved, or planned for during the brief productive months. A single miscalculation in autumn could mean starvation by spring. This created constant pressure that shaped not just how Vikings built their homes, but how they thought about survival itself. The psychological weight of Viking winter is almost impossible for modern people to fully grasp. Imagine knowing that for the next 6 months, you cannot simply leave if things go wrong. There is no moving to a warmer climate, no emergency shelter, no rescue services coming to save you. Your home either works or you die. Your food supplies either last or you starve. Your fire either stays lit or you freeze. These weren't abstract possibilities. They were mathematical certainties that every Viking family understood with absolute clarity. The darkness compounded everything. Modern people experience seasonal depression from a few hours of reduced daylight. Vikings endured weeks where the sun barely rose above the horizon, casting everything in perpetual twilight or complete blackness. This darkness wasn't just inconvenient. It was disorienting, exhausting, and mentally crushing. It made simple tasks difficult and sapped motivation when motivation was most needed. Yet Viking communities didn't collapse into despair. They adapted. They created routines, rituals, and social structures that carried them through the darkest months. And at the center of all these adaptations was the Longhouse, a structure so carefully designed that it turned winter from an unsurvivable nightmare into merely a long, uncomfortable season that could be endured with proper planning and disciplines. Vikings understood something that modern architects often forget. The ground beneath your feet is one of the most stable, reliable insulators available, and it costs nothing but labor to access. When Vikings chose a location for a new home, they didn't immediately start building upward like people constructing a monument to their own ambition. Instead, they dug downward, carving out a shallow depression that would become the foundation and lower walls of the structure. This wasn't a basement in the modern sense. It was a deliberate strategy to place the living space partially below ground level, surrounding it with earth that would act as a thermal buffer against the chaos happening above. The soil didn't react to sudden temperature swings the way air did. While surface temperatures could drop 30 or 40 degrees overnight, the earth just a few feet down remained remarkably consistent. It held on to warmth from summer and released it slowly throughout winter. It absorbed the killing cold of winter and prevented it from penetrating inward too quickly. By sinking their homes into this stable layer, Vikings immediately gained an advantage that required no fuel, no maintenance, and no stop. The practical benefits extended beyond simple temperature regulation. A partially sunken house presented a lower profile to the wind, which was crucial in landscapes where winter gales could reach terrifying speeds. Wind doesn't just make cold air feel colder through wind chill. It actively strips heat away from any exposed surface, including walls and roofs. A house standing tall and proud above the landscape gives wind endless opportunities to attack from multiple angles, finding every tiny gap and weakness. A house hunkered down into the earth, with only its roof and upper walls exposed, offers far less surface area for wind to assault. The earth itself became a shield, deflecting the worst of the wind's force and creating a pocket of relative calm around the structure. Vikings also understood drainage, because cold was dangerous, but cold combined with moisture was deadly. They positioned their sunken floors with slight grades that directed water away from the living areas. Melting snow and ice couldn't pool around the foundation and seep inward, creating damp conditions that would sap heat and promote rot. Every detail of the excavation was intentional, born from generations of bitter experience. Vikings didn't dig into the earth because it looked interesting. They did it because every winter proved, with mathematical certainty, that homes built this way kept people alive while homes built differently did not. Once Vikings had established their foundation in the earth, they turned their attention to constructing walls that could withstand months of relentless assault from wind, snow, and sub-zero temperatures. Thin walls were never even considered as an option. They weren't just inadequate for the climate. They were functionally useless, little better than hanging a curtain between your family and the frozen wasteland outside. Viking walls were built with extraordinary thickness, often measuring 2 feet or more at their base, constructed from multiple layers of different materials that each served a specific purpose. The innermost layer typically consisted of timber framing, which provided structural integrity and prevented the wall from collapsing under its own considerable weight. Outside this framework came packed earth and turf, dense and heavy, pressed together so tightly that air could barely move through it. Stone was used at the base where available, creating a stable foundation that wouldn't shift or sink over time. Each material compensated for the weaknesses of the others. Wood alone would eventually rot from moisture. Earth alone would erode. Stone alone conducted cold. Together, layered and integrated, they created a composite barrier that cold air had to fight through inch by stubborn inch. The mass of these walls was as important as their thickness. Heavy walls don't just block cold. They absorb and store thermal energy, acting as massive batteries that collect heat during the day and release it slowly at night. When a fire burned in the hearth, warmth didn't simply heat the air and then vanish. It soaked into the walls themselves, radiating back into the living space for hours after the flames had died down to embers. This thermal mass smoothed out temperature fluctuations, preventing the dramatic swings that make buildings uncomfortable and dangerous. A modern house with thin walls experiences rapid heat loss the moment the furnace stops. A Viking longhouse with walls 2 feet thick maintained relatively stable temperatures even when the fire was banked low overnight. Vikings also understood that walls needed constant attention. They didn't build once and assume the job was finished. Cracks were filled immediately with fresh earth and turf. Settling was corrected. Damage from storms was repaired before the next storm arrived. This wasn't optional maintenance, it was survival maintenance. A gap in the wall that seemed minor in autumn could become a lethal draft pathway by midwinter, allowing cold air to pour into the home and strip away precious heat. Viking walls were ugly by any aesthetic standard. They bulged irregularly, they sagged in places. They looked crude and temporary, but they worked with ruthless efficiency. And in the end, that was the only standard that mattered. At some point in their history, Vikings made an observation that would transform their entire approach to home construction. Grass, dirt, and roots, when cut into blocks and stacked properly, created insulation superior to almost anything else available. Turf became the cornerstone of Viking building technology, not because it was exotic or expensive, but because it was everywhere, cost nothing but labor to harvest, and performed miracles when used correctly. These weren't delicate strips of lawn carefully transplanted for decoration. These were dense, heavy blocks cut from fields and marshes, each one containing years of accumulated growth. The grass roots formed natural binding networks that held the soil together even when stacked vertically. The soil itself was full of tiny air pockets that trapped heat and blocked cold. Moisture in the turf, rather than being a weakness, actually contributed to its insulating properties when properly managed. Vikings would cut these blocks to uniform sizes, then layer them across walls and roofs like enormous green bricks, sometimes stacking them 3 or 4 courses deep. The result was a living envelope that wrapped the entire structure in protection, that actually improved over time as the roots continued to interweave and strengthen. The genius of turf insulation revealed itself most clearly on the roof, where Vikings piled it so thick that their homes looked less like buildings and more like grass-covered hills that had sprouted chimneys. Snow that fell on these roofs didn't slide off immediately, like it would from steep wooden shingles or modern metal roofing. Instead, it accumulated and stayed, adding yet another insulating layer that Vikings welcomed rather than feared. Modern homeowners panic when snow builds up on their roofs, worrying about structural failure and ice dams. Vikings watched snow pile up and thought, "Excellent, free insulation from the sky." The weight was considerable, absolutely, but Viking roof structures were built specifically to handle it, with massive timber beams that could support several tons of combined turf and snow without complaint. The turf also sealed itself naturally over time. As it settled and compacted, it filled its own gaps, eliminating drafts without requiring constant human intervention. Rain and melting snow were absorbed by the soil rather than penetrating through to the interior. The grass continued growing during warmer months, its roots spreading and tightening the entire mass into an increasingly effective barrier. Vikings had created a roofing system that literally healed and strengthened itself, requiring minimal maintenance while providing maximum protection. And perhaps most remarkably, when properly installed, turf roofs could last decades, far longer than the wooden alternatives used in other parts of Europe, which rotted, split, and required frequent replacement. Vikings made a deliberate choice that modern people would find claustrophobic and uncomfortable. They kept their ceilings low, very low, barely clearing the height of a standing adult in many cases. This wasn't an accident of poor planning or limited resources. It was a calculated decision based on a simple understanding of how heat behaves. Warm air rises, always and inevitably, following the laws of physics without exception. In a room with high ceilings, that warm air drifts upward and lingers uselessly above human height, heating empty space while the people below remain cold. Vikings had no interest in warming unused vertical space. They wanted every bit of heat to stay exactly where their bodies were, and low ceilings accomplished this with brutal efficiency. The distance from floor to ceiling in many long houses was just 7 or 8 feet, sometimes less in sleeping areas. Tall visitors learned quickly to move carefully or suffer repeated impacts with overhead beams. But this inconvenience was trivial compared to the thermal benefit. Heat generated by the fire, by cooking, and by human bodies themselves stayed trapped in the breathing zone where it could actually warm people rather than escaping into architectural vanity. Okay? The psychological impact of low ceilings during long Arctic winters was more complex than simple heat retention. Humans instinctively respond to enclosed spaces differently than open ones. High ceilings create feelings of grandeur and freedom, but it also exposure and vulnerability. Low ceilings create intimacy and protection. During winter storms, when winds screamed outside and darkness pressed against the walls, the low roof of a Viking long house felt less like a restriction and more like shelter, like being wrapped in a... The space felt human-scaled, controllable, safe. Modern people living in houses with vaulted ceilings and open floor plans often feel isolated. Even when not alone, their voices and presence lost in too much space. Vikings in their low-roofed homes felt constantly aware of each other's proximity, which during the isolated months of winter was a feature rather than a bug. This compression of space also had practical social benefits. Conversations didn't require shouting across vast rooms. Sound carried easily, creating a sense of connection and shared experience. The structure of the ceiling itself contributed to thermal performance beyond just trapping warm air. Heavy timber beams overhead, covered in layers of turf, created massive thermal mass directly above the living space. This mass absorbed heat rising from below and radiated it back downward, creating a gentle circulation that kept temperatures more stable throughout the day and night. Vikings weren't trying to create comfortable living spaces by modern standards. They were trying to create survivable ones, and in that goal, low ceilings succeeded perfectly. The hearth at the center of a Viking long house was not decorative, romantic, or optional. It was the beating heart that kept the entire system alive, functioning with such critical importance that letting it die was considered a failure bordering on catastrophic. Vikings positioned their fires centrally, not against a wall where modern fireplaces typically sit, but in the exact middle of the living space, where heat could radiate outward in all directions simultaneously. This placement was mathematically optimal. Every wall received warmth. Every sleeping platform benefited. Every person in the house had relatively equal access to heat, rather than creating warm and cold zones that would force constant migration and conflict. The fire itself was tended with extraordinary care and discipline. It wasn't allowed to roar wastefully, consuming fuel at unsustainable rates. Instead, it burned low and steady, maintained at a level that provided consistent warmth without requiring constant feeding. Vikings became experts at reading their fires, understanding exactly how much wood or peat to add, and precisely when to add it to maintain the ideal burn rate. Too hot and fuel vanished too quickly. Too cool and the house grew dangerously cold. The balance required attention and skills that were taught to children as soon as they could safely approach the flames. Fuel management was perhaps the most critical calculation of Viking winter survival. Wood had to be gathered, cut, and dried during the brief summer months, then stored in quantities sufficient to last 6 months or more of continuous burning. Running out of fuel in January meant death, plain and simple. There were no emergency deliveries, no neighbors with surplus to share, no alternatives. Vikings stockpiled fuel with the same seriousness modern people stockpile medication or emergency supplies, except their lives depended on it every single day. Peat was often used in regions where wood was scarce, cut from bogs in dense blocks that burned slowly and steadily, though with less heat than seasoned hardwood. Even dried animal dung was used when necessary, producing usable heat despite the unpleasant smoke. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was burned frivolously. Every piece of fuel was precious, rationed carefully across the long, dark months. The hearth also served multiple simultaneous functions that modern appliances have since separated into distinct devices. It cooked food, obviously, but also dried wet clothing that would otherwise sap body heat. It provided light in the long darkness, allowing work and social activity to continue after sunset. It heated water for washing and cooking. It kept tools from freezing and metal from becoming brittle. The fire was stove, heater, lamp, and dryer all in one, operating continuously without electricity, without complex mechanisms, without anything except fuel, air, and human attention. Vikings didn't worship their hearths, but they respected them with a seriousness that bordered on religious because they understood that fire was the difference between life and death. Modern people instinctively recoil from the idea of living in a smoky environment, associating it with discomfort, health hazards, and poor design. Vikings had a completely different relationship with smoke. They didn't love it exactly, but they understood it was part of a functional system that delivered far more benefits than problems. Early Viking longhouses lacked the tall stone chimneys that would later become standard in European architecture. Instead, smoke from the central hearth drifted upward naturally, collected near the ceiling, and escaped slowly through deliberate vents and gaps in the roof structure. This wasn't accidental or primitive. It was engineered with surprising sophistication. The smoke layer remained above head height, most of the time hovering in the upper portions of the low-ceilinged space where people didn't breathe it constantly. Fresh air entered through lower openings and drafts, creating a natural circulation pattern that pulled smoke upward and outward. Vikings learned to read this smoke, understanding that its behavior indicated how well the house was sealed and how efficiently the fire was burning. Too much smoke lingering low meant ventilation needed adjustment. Too little smoke might mean drafts were stealing heat. The smoke itself became diagnostic information about the home's performance. What Vikings recognized and what modern critics often miss is that smoke delivered several crucial benefits that justified the discomfort. First, and most importantly, it preserved the structure itself. The constant exposure to smoke-dried timber beams, thoroughly and continuously, preventing the rot that would otherwise destroy wood in the damp conditions created by cooking, breathing, and moisture from snow melt. Smoke-dried wood lasted decades longer than untreated timber, effectively smoking the house from the inside like preserving meat. Second, smoke discouraged insects and parasites that would otherwise infest the warm, sheltered environment. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, and wood-boring insects all found the smoky atmosphere hostile and uninhabitable. In an era without chemical pesticides, this was an enormous advantage that reduced disease and discomfort significantly. Third, The layer of soot that gradually built up in cracks and joints acted as a natural sealant, filling tiny gaps that would otherwise allow drafts. The house essentially caulked itself over time, becoming tighter and more efficient with age. Vikings didn't suffer smoke because they had no alternative. They tolerated it because they understood it was working for them, performing essential functions that would otherwise require constant labor and resources. The smoke was a partner in survival, not an enemy to be eliminated at all costs. Over generations, Viking families adapted to the environment. Eyes adjusted. Lungs developed tolerance. People learned instinctively where to sit and stand to avoid the worst of it, reading air currents the way modern people read traffic patterns. Unconsciously and automatically, privacy is a modern luxury that Vikings could not afford, and frankly did, not prioritize during winter months when survival depended on thermal efficiency. Viking longhouses were deliberately crowded, packed with people, animals, supplies, and equipment in a way that would violate every contemporary building code and social norm. This wasn't poverty or poor planning. It was strategic heat management disguised as communal living. Every warm-blooded creature inside the house contributed to the overall thermal environment, generating body heat that accumulated in the enclosed space and reduced the workload on the fire. A longhouse might contain an extended family of 10 to 20 people, plus sheep, goats, or cattle brought indoors during the harshest months. Modern sensibilities recoil at the idea of sharing living space with livestock, imagining the smell, the noise, and the hygiene issues. Vikings calculated differently. A cow generates an enormous amount of body heat, roughly equivalent to a small space heater running continuously. Several cows in one end of the longhouse, separated by a low partition but sharing the same airspace, could raise the interior temperature by several critical degrees without consuming any fuel whatsoever. The smell was unpleasant, absolutely, but freezing to death was worse. Vikings made that trade without hesitation. Human crowding served similar purposes with added social benefits. Families didn't sleep in separate bedrooms scattered throughout a sprawling house. They slept on raised platforms along the walls, arranged close together, often with multiple people sharing sleeping spaces and blankets. This wasn't romantic, it was thermodynamics. Body heat shared is body heat multiplied. Two people sleeping together stay warmer than two people sleeping apart, a principle Vikings understood instinctively and applied ruthlessly. Children slept with parents. Siblings huddled together. Even unrelated members of the household shared sleeping areas without the privacy modern people consider essential. The social intimacy this created was intense and unavoidable, but it also built cohesion and mutual dependence that strengthened the household as a unit. During winter storms that could last days, when leaving the house meant risking death from exposure, this enforced closeness became a psychological survival mechanism as much as a physical one. People had each other constantly, for better or worse, and that constant presence provided reassurance that you weren't facing the long dark alone. The crowded conditions also meant that daily activities, cooking, tool repair, textile work, storytelling all happened in shared space where everyone could participate or observe. Knowledge transferred naturally from experienced to inexperienced members. Skills were taught through proximity and repetition. The longhouse became a living classroom where survival knowledge passed from generation to generation. Not through formal instruction, but through constant immersion in the practices that kept everyone alive. Viking beds were not pieces of furniture that could be rearranged when someone wanted a change of scenery. They were permanent architecture, built directly into the structure of the longhouse with the same careful attention given to walls and roofs. These sleeping platforms ran along the length of the interior walls, raised approximately 2 to 3 feet off the floor, creating elevated spaces that served as beds, seating, and personal territory within the communal living area. The elevation was critical for thermal reasons that Vikings understood through generations of cold experience. Cold air is heavy and sinks to the lowest available point, pooling on the floor like invisible water. Anyone sleeping directly on the ground would spend the night in the coldest layer of air in the entire house, losing body heat through conduction into the frozen earth below. By raising sleeping platforms well above floor level, Vikings positioned themselves in the warmer air that naturally stratified in the enclosed space. The difference between sleeping on the floor and sleeping 3 feet above it could easily be 10 or 15 degrees, the difference between miserable discomfort and tolerable rest. These platforms weren't soft or luxurious. They were wooden frames, sometimes with rope or leather webbing to provide minimal cushioning, covered with layers of furs, wool blankets, and whatever textiles the household could produce or acquire. The real insulation came from the furs, piled thick and heavy until sleepers were essentially buried under animal skins. Sheep, reindeer, bear, seal, whatever could be hunted or raised was skinned, and the pelts preserved for bedding. These weren't decorative throws. They were survival equipment, layered so deeply that movement became difficult, but heat loss became nearly impossible. Vikings understood that maintaining core body temperature during sleep was non-negotiable. The human body is vulnerable during sleep, unable to shiver effectively or respond to cold. Without adequate insulation, a person could slip into hypothermia during the night and never wake up. The furs created microenvironments of trapped air, warmed by body heat, surrounding each sleeper in a cocoon that held warmth, even when the fire burned low and the house cooled during the darkest hours before dawn. Sharing these sleeping platforms wasn't optional for most families. Space was limited, and warmth was multiplied when bodies pressed close together. Children slept with parents until they were old enough to generate sufficient body heat on their own, and slept with siblings. The elderly, whose bodies generated less heat and were more vulnerable to cold, were given the warmest positions closest to the hearth or surrounded by younger, warmer bodies. This wasn't sentiment, it was practical resource management. Losing an elder meant losing accumulated knowledge and experience that the community needed to survive. The sleeping platforms also served as personal space in a house that offered almost no privacy, the one area where individuals could retreat, store personal items, and claim a small territory as their own within the larger collective existence of winter survival. The doorway of a Viking longhouse was designed with the same defensive mindset that governed every other element of the structure, because an opening is fundamentally a weakness, a breach in the thermal envelope that threatens everything the design accomplishes. Vikings responded by making their doors as small as physically possible, while still allowing human passage. These weren't grand entrances that welcomed visitors with open arms. They were narrow, low openings that forced everyone, regardless of status or size, to bend down and squeeze through. A tall warrior had to hunch. A visiting chieftain had to bow. Every single person who entered acknowledged, through physical submission, that this threshold was controlled space. The small size was entirely intentional, driven by ruthless thermal logic. A large door opening allows massive heat loss every single time it opens. Warm air rushes out at the top while cold air floods in at the bottom, creating a devastating exchange that can drop interior temperatures noticeably within seconds. A small door limits this exchange dramatically. Less area means less air movement, less heat loss, less cold intrusion. The door could be opened, someone could pass through, and the door could be closed again before the interior environment was seriously compromised. The doors themselves were constructed from thick wooden planks fitted tightly together, heavy enough that they didn't rattle or shift when wind pressed against them. There were no gaps at the edges, no decorative windows, no mail slots or convenient openings. every potential air leak was eliminated with the same thoroughness applied to the walls. Some doors were recessed into short tunnels or entry passages that created additional buffering space between the outside and the interior. This vestibule effect meant that opening the outer door didn't immediately expose the main living space to external conditions. Cold air had to travel through the passage, losing some of its bite before reaching the hearth area. Vikings also positioned doors strategically, placing them on the sides of the structure least exposed to prevailing winds whenever the terrain allowed. Foul. Opening a door directly into a winter gale was avoided when possible, not just for comfort, but because wind-driven cold could penetrate deep into the house in seconds, undoing hours of careful heat conservation. The psychological impact of the small doorway shouldn't be underestimated either. Passing through that low, narrow opening created a distinct transition between the hostile outside world and the protected interior. You couldn't rush through carelessly. You had to pause, bend, focus, and move deliberately. That moment of transition reinforced the boundary, reminding everyone that the interior space was different, special, defended. Once inside, with the door shut firmly behind you, the long house felt like exactly what it was, a fortress against winter, small and cramped perhaps, but utterly committed to keeping death outside where it belonged. The crucial insight that separates Viking home design from simple folk architecture is understanding that nothing worked in isolation. Every element that has been described, the sunken foundation, the massive walls, the living turf insulation, the low ceilings, the central hearth, the smoke, the crowding, the elevated beds, the defensive doors, existed as part of an integrated system where each component supported and reinforced the others. Remove any single element, and the entire structure became significantly less effective. Weaken one component, and the whole system had to compensate. Vikings didn't stumble onto one clever building trick and call it sufficient. They developed a comprehensive approach to winter survival that addressed thermal retention from every possible angle simultaneously. The earth provided stable base temperatures. The thick walls added mass and resistance. The turf created an active insulating envelope. The low ceiling trapped heat at human height. The fire generated warmth. The smoke preserved the structure. The crowding multiplied body heat. The beds positioned people in the warmest zones. The doors prevented catastrophic heat loss. Each element played its role, but the magic happened in how they interacted and overlapped, creating redundancy that meant the failure of one component didn't doom the entire household. This systematic approach meant that Viking homes could withstand tremendous variation in conditions without catastrophic failure. If fuel ran lower than expected and the fire had to be kept smaller, the massive walls and thick insulation compensated by releasing stored heat more slowly. If a particularly fierce storm created drafts that normally wouldn't exist, the crowded interior and shared body heat picked up the slack. If the turf roof became waterlogged and temporarily less effective, the sunken foundation and earth-bermed walls continued protecting the space. The system was resilient precisely because it was redundant, with multiple overlapping strategies all working toward the same goal. Modern buildings often depend on single-point solutions. The furnace keeps you warm. If it fails, you freeze. The insulation keeps heat in. If it's inadequate, your heating bills skyrocket. Vikings couldn't afford that kind of vulnerability. They built systems that degraded gracefully, where problems reduced efficiency but didn't immediately threaten survival. This systematic thinking also explains why Viking homes look so crude to modern eyes. So, there's no wasted elegance, no decorative flourishes, no architectural features that exist purely for aesthetics. Every visible element serves a function, and every function is critical. The result is honest, almost brutal in its practicality, but also deeply intelligent in ways that become apparent only when you understand the whole rather than judging individual parts. Viking homes never froze not because of any single brilliant innovation, but because Vikings understood that survival required complete solutions, partial ones. Vikings operated under constraints that would horrify modern energy consumers: limited fuel, no backup systems, and absolutely no margin for waste. Every calorie of heat generated inside the longhouse had to be captured, used, and used again before being allowed to escape. This wasn't environmental consciousness in the contemporary sense. It was survival economics enforced by the simple reality that wasted heat meant someone might freeze. The central hearth didn't just warm the air. It cooked food simultaneously, meaning the heat required for meal preparation also heated the living space. Nothing was cooked separately in a cold kitchen. Every pot of boiling water, every roasted meat, every baked bread released its thermal energy into the house while serving its primary food purpose. When clothing or furs became wet from snow or sweat, they weren't dried in some separate utility area. They were hung near the fire where the heat that would be generated anyway did double duty, warming the house while evaporating moisture. Even the moisture itself wasn't entirely wasted. In extremely dry winter conditions, some humidity made the air less harsh to breathe, though Vikings had to balance this carefully to avoid condensation that would freeze on walls and create damaging ice. The thermal mass of the walls and floor functioned as a heat battery that stored energy during peak burning times and released it during low burn periods. During the day when people were active and the fire burned hotter for cooking, the stone and earth absorbed excess heat rather than letting it escape through the roof vents. At night, when the fire was banked low and heat generation dropped, those same materials slowly released their stored warmth back into the living space, smoothing out the temperature curve and preventing the dramatic overnight drops that would make sleep impossible. This passive heat storage required no technology, no controls, no moving parts. It simply exploited the physical properties of mass and thermal conductivity that Vikings understood intuitively, even if they lacked modern terminology to describe it. Body heat from humans and animals was similarly captured and retained, rather than allowed to dissipate uselessly. The crowded conditions and enclosed space meant that every person and animal was effectively a small heater, contributing to the collective warmth. A household of 15 people and 5 animals represented roughly 3,000 watts of continuous heat generation from metabolic processes alone, equivalent to running 3 space heaters 24 hours a day without consuming any fuel whatsoever. Vikings didn't just tolerate the crowding, they exploited it deliberately, understanding that in winter, isolation was thermally expensive and potentially deadly. Even small actions reflected this zero-waste mentality. Ashes from the fire weren't simply discarded. They were banked over live coals at night to insulate them and keep them alive until morning, eliminating the need to restart the fire from scratch in a frozen house with frozen hands. This practice alone probably saved countless lives over the centuries, turning what could have been a daily crisis into a manageable routine. The true test of Viking home design came during the worst storms, when wind-driven snow buried the landscape and visibility dropped to zero, within arm's reach of the walls. Outside, the world became actively hostile to human life, a white chaos where exposed skin froze in minutes and disorientation could be fatal within meters of safety. These weren't weather events that modern people experience while watching through insulated windows with central heating running continuously. These were survival situations where being caught outside meant probable death, and being inside meant enduring hours or days of sensory assault. as wind screamed and snow pressed against every surface with crushing weight. Yet inside the longhouse, a completely different reality existed. The thick walls absorbed the violence of the storm without transmitting it inward. Wind could howl at hurricane force, but inside the air remained still and relatively quiet. Snow could pile 6 feet deep against the walls, but inside, temperatures stayed within the survivable range that the fire and insulation maintained. The contrast was so complete that children born during winter might experience their first storm from inside the longhouse and have no real comprehension of the deadly conditions existing just beyond the turf and timber. This stability wasn't accidental or lucky. It was engineered into every element of the structure specifically to create a predictable interior environment regardless of what chaos erupted outside. The psychological value of this predictability cannot be overstated. Winter in the far north lasted 6 months or more, during which multiple severe storms would test the household. If each storm created panic, disrupted routines, and threatened the interior environment, the cumulative psychological toll would be devastating. People would live in constant fear, never able to relax, always waiting for the next crisis. Instead, Viking homes created an interior world that remained essentially unchanged during storms. The fire burned the same way. The sleeping areas provided the same warmth. Meals were prepared on the same schedule. Life continued with stubborn normalcy, even when the outside world had temporarily ceased to be habitable. This allowed families to maintain mental stability and routine, which in turn allowed them to make good decisions, maintain social cohesion, and avoid the panic-driven mistakes that could turn a survivable situation into a fatal one. The longhouse didn't just protect bodies from freezing, it protected minds from the psychological erosion of endless winter darkness and repeated violent weather. That protection was as essential to survival as any physical barrier against cold, because humans who lose hope and routine during prolonged stress make poor decisions. And in Viking winters, poor decisions killed quickly and without second chances. There exists a persistent romantic notion that Vikings survived their brutal environment through sheer toughness, as if they were simply built differently than other humans, more resistant to pain, cold, and hardship. This narrative is appealing and flattering to Viking culture, but it's also fundamentally wrong. Vikings froze to death just as easily as anyone else when exposed to the elements. Their fingers went numb at the same temperatures. Their bodies succumbed to hypothermia following the same physiological progression. Frostbite damaged their tissue with identical severity. The cold didn't respect reputation, heritage, or courage. It killed based purely on physics, and physics doesn't negotiate. What actually separated Vikings from populations that couldn't survive in similar climates wasn't superior physical constitution, it was superior planning. Vikings assumed from the beginning that direct confrontation with winter weather was a battle they would lose every single time. They didn't try to be tough enough to endure exposure. They tried to avoid exposure entirely. They didn't attempt to generate enough body heat to overwhelm the cold. They built systems that trapped and conserved whatever heat they could produce. Every design decision in the longhouse reflected this fundamental humility in the face of environmental reality. And this planning mindset extended beyond physical construction into every aspect of winter preparation. Food had to be preserved during summer in quantities sufficient for months of consumption. Fuel had to be gathered, dried, and stockpiled with mathematical precision. Clothing had to be made from materials that would retain warmth, even when damp. Social structures had to be organized to prevent conflicts that could fracture. The household during the months when leaving wasn't an option. None of this required physical toughness. It required foresight, discipline, and the willingness to do boring, repetitive work for months in advance of when it would become critical. A Viking household that failed to plan properly wouldn't be saved by courage or strength. They would simply die, slowly and miserably, as their fuel ran out or their food stores proved insufficient. The longhouse itself represented thousands of hours of labor invested in creating a structure that would function reliably for years or decades. Digging the foundation, layering the walls, harvesting and stacking turf, cutting and positioning timber beams, none of this was glamorous work. It was exhausting physical labor that had to be completed during the brief months when weather permitted outdoor construction. But Vikings did it anyway, year after year, generation after generation, because they understood that winter didn't care about excuses. The house either worked or it didn't, and heroic endurance couldn't compensate for poor design. Planning, in the Viking worldview, wasn't cowardice or weakness. It was the highest form of intelligence, the recognition that some battles cannot be won through confrontation and must instead be won through preparation, forethought, and respect for forces larger than human will. After examining every component of Viking home construction, the answer to why these structures never froze becomes almost disappointingly simple. There was no secret. There was no lost ancient knowledge. There was no single brilliant innovation that modern people have somehow forgotten. Viking homes never froze because Vikings refused to rely on any single solution, and instead built comprehensive systems that addressed winter survival from every conceivable angle, simultaneously. They didn't hope their walls would be thick enough. They made them absurdly thick, and then covered them with living insulation, and then buried part of the house in the earth for additional protection. They didn't trust that their fire would stay lit. They developed fuel management practices, banking techniques, and social protocols that made fire maintenance a shared responsibility impossible to neglect. They didn't assume their design would work. They tested it every single winter and adjusted anything that failed, passing improved techniques to the next generation. This relentless, systematic approach created structures that had enormous margins of safety built into every element. The final truth is that Viking homes never froze because Vikings took winter seriously in ways that modern people, cushioned by technology and backup systems, can barely comprehend. They understood that nature was indifferent to human survival, and that comfort was a luxury that came only after survival was secured. They built ugly, cramped, smoky, crowded homes not because they lacked imagination or aesthetic sense, but because they prioritized function over form with absolute discipline. Every element that made the longhouse uncomfortable by modern standards, the low ceilings that forced people to hunch, the smoke that irritated eyes, the crowding that eliminated privacy, the small doors that required submission, existed because it solved a survival problem more effectively than any comfortable alternative. Vikings made these trade-offs consciously and repeatedly, choosing life over luxury every single time. When modern people look at Viking homes and see primitive conditions, they're measuring against the wrong standard. The correct comparison isn't between Viking homes and modern heated houses. It's between Viking homes and frozen death. And by that measure, the longhouse was an absolute masterpiece of engineering. It kept families alive through months of conditions that would kill unprepared people within hours. It did this using only materials available locally, technology that required no external power, and design principles that any community could replicate. The Viking longhouse never froze because it was never designed to be impressive. It was designed to work, and in the most important measure possible, it worked perfectly. In the spring of 1702, Edo Castle stood as the political heart of Tokugawa Japan, a place where power moved through gesture and implication, rather than open conflict. The shogunate ruled through carefully maintained order, and within the castle walls, protocol mattered more than almost anything else. Every bow had meaning. Every word carried weight. This was a world where reputation could be destroyed through subtle insult more effectively than through any weapon, and where maintaining face wasn't vanity but survival. Into this delicate environment stepped Asano Naganori, a relatively young daimyo from the Aku domain, assigned to help prepare ceremonies for receiving imperial envoys. This should have been a routine honor, a chance to demonstrate competence and earn recognition. Instead, it became the trigger for one of Japan's most enduring legends. Asano's guide through the complex ceremonial requirements was Kira Yoshinaka, a senior court official whose job was to instruct visiting lords in proper etiquette. On paper, this arrangement made perfect sense. In practice, it was a disaster waiting to unfold, because Kira was not simply an instructor. He was a man with expectations, particularly regarding gifts and deference, and when those expectations weren't met, he made his displeasure known through methods that were cruel precisely because they were subtle. The insults began quietly. Kira mocked Asano's clothing choices, suggesting they were provincial and unsuitable for court. He criticized Asano's manners, implying that someone from such a remote domain couldn't possibly understand proper behavior. Shouted accusations. They were quiet observations delivered within earshot of others, designed to humiliate without providing grounds for formal complaint. In samurai culture, where honor formed the foundation of identity, such treatment was excruciating. Asano was trapped in an impossible position. To respond with anger would violate protocol and disgrace himself. To ignore the insults would confirm them and accept humiliation. He chose to endure silently, swallowing rage that built with each passing day. Then on the 14th day of the third month, something inside Asano broke. After yet another public slight from Kira, he drew his short sword in a hallway of Edo Castle and struck at his tormentor. The blade connected, wounding Kira but not killing him. Guards intervened immediately, restraining Asano before he could strike again. Blood had been spilled inside the shogun's palace. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not Asano's grievances, not Kira's provocations, not questions of justice or fairness. The law was absolute and unambiguous. Drawing a weapon within Edo Castle was among the gravest crimes imaginable, and punishment would be swift, certain, and merciless. That single desperate strike, born from months of accumulated humiliation, set in motion events that would echo through Japanese culture for centuries, transforming a personal conflict into a national meditation on loyalty, honor, and the price of both. The immediate aftermath of Asano's attack was brutally efficient. Sunset on the same day, he was ordered to commit seppuku, ritual suicide that would allow him to die with some measure of honor intact. There was no investigation into Kira's behavior, no consideration of provocation, no mercy. The shogunate valued order above all else, and Asano had shattered that order in the most sacred space in the realm. He composed a death poem, dressed in formal attire, and performed the ritual before witnesses. By nightfall, Asano Naganori was dead, his lands confiscated, his household dissolved, and his retainers transformed overnight into Ronin, masterless samurai adrift in a society that defined them entirely by service to a lord. For these men, suddenly stripped of purpose and livelihood, the injustice was overwhelming. Their master had been driven to desperation by systematic cruelty, then executed without consideration of the circumstances. Kira, the man whose behavior had triggered everything, walked away with a minor wound and no punishment whatsoever. To the Ronin, this imbalance demanded correction. But acting immediately was impossible. The shogunate was watching, expecting exactly such a response. At the center of the former retainers stood Oishi Kuranosuke, Asano's chief advisor and the man now faced with an impossible decision. Revenge would honor their dead lord, but it would also guarantee their own deaths and potentially harm Asano's memory further. if handled poorly. Oishi chose a path that required almost superhuman patience. He would plan revenge, but he would do it so carefully and over such an extended period that Kira would eventually believe the danger had passed. The strategy was psychological warfare, conducted over years rather than weeks. Oishi deliberately destroyed his own reputation, moving to Kyoto and behaving like a man who had abandoned all principles. He drank publicly and excessively. He frequented entertainment districts. He appeared broken, dissolute, and completely uninterested in avenging his master. Spies sent by Kira to watch the former Akko retainers reported exactly what Oishi wanted them to see: defeated men who had given up on honor and were simply trying to survive. Meanwhile, in absolute secrecy, Oishi maintained contact with the most loyal of Asano's former retainers. 47 men ultimately committed to the plan, knowing it would cost them everything. They scattered across Japan, taking ordinary jobs, blending into normal life, gathering information about Kira's residence and routines. They acquired weapons slowly and carefully, never in patterns that would attract attention. They waded through summer heat and winter cold, through festivals and famines, for nearly 2 years, maintaining perfect discipline while the world assumed they had forgotten their duty. This waiting was its own form of torture, perhaps worse than any physical hardship, because it required them to appear as failures and cowards while planning an act that would prove the opposite. On the 14th night of the 12th month in Ichen Chibaitling San, nearly 2 years after Asano's death, Ito lay buried under heavy snow that muffled sound and emptied the streets early. The timing was deliberate. Kira's vigilance had finally relaxed after months of apparent inactivity from the Akko Ronin. His guards had grown complacent. The weather provided cover. Everything aligned for the only chance the 47 would likely ever get. Just before midnight, the Ronin assembled from different directions, converging on Kira's residence, dressed in matching gear that identified them clearly as Asano's former retainers. This was not an assassination meant to be hidden, public declaration of loyalty, and they wanted everyone to know exactly who they were and why they had come. Before the attack began, they struck bells deliberately to wake the neighborhood and alert authorities. They were not sneaking or hiding. They were announcing their intention to the world. The assault itself was controlled and precise despite the violence. The Ronin divided into 2 groups, one attacking the front gate while the other breached from the rear, preventing escape and eliminating confusion about who was inside. Guards were overwhelmed quickly. Some killed, others disarmed and restrained. The Ronin showed no interest in looting, no cruelty towards servants or family members. Their target was singular and specific. Inside the residence, Kira was moved frantically from room to room by his remaining defenders, hidden in storage areas and back chambers as the sounds of fighting drew steadily closer. The Ronin searched methodically, calling out Kira's name, demanding he face them. Snow continued falling outside, coating everything in white silence, while inside, lanterns shattered and swords rang against each other. Eventually they found him crouched in a shed, shaking and unable or unwilling to speak. Oishi identified himself formally and explained why they had come, offering Kira the same opportunity Asano had been given, to die honorably by his own hand through seppuku. A dagger was placed before him. Kira stared at it but could not bring himself to act. Whether from fear, pride, or simple paralysis, he refused the chance to control his own death. After waiting in silence to give him every opportunity, Oishi ended it himself with a single stroke, using the same blade Asano had used in his attack nearly 2 years earlier. The Ronin washed Kira's severed head, wrapped it respectfully, and departed as calmly as they had arrived. Snow fell on them as they walked through streets that were beginning to fill with onlookers who understood immediately what had happened. The revenge was complete, executed flawlessly and publicly. Now came the reckoning. The 47 Ronin did not run or hide after killing Kira. Instead, they walked in formation through the snowy streets of Edo to Sengakuji Temple, where Lord Asano was buried, and placed Kira's head at their master's grave as proof that their duty had been fulfilled. Then they waited calmly for authorities to arrive, surrendering without resistance when officials came to arrest them. They had never intended to escape. The act itself was the entire point, and survival was never part of the plan. What followed exposed a fundamental tension in Tokugawa society that had no easy resolution. The Ronin had violated the law by committing premeditated murder. By every legal standard, they were criminals deserving execution. Yet they had also demonstrated the highest ideals of samurai loyalty. Enduring years of hardship and sacrifice to avenge their master's unjust death. To execute them like common murderers seemed to dishonor everything the samurai class claimed to value. To pardon them would suggest that personal revenge was acceptable, potentially inviting chaos and endless cycles of vendetta. The shogunate deliberated for weeks, while the Ronin remained under house arrest in the residences of sympathetic daimyo, or treated with respect rather than imprisoned like criminals. The final decision was a careful compromise. The 47 were sentenced to death, but allowed to die by seppuku rather than execution, preserving their honor even as the law was satisfied. On the appointed day, they prepared calmly, wrote death poems, and performed the ritual one by one. They were buried beside their master at Sengakuji, where their graves remain to this day, constantly tended and visited by people who see in their story something that transcends the specific historical circumstances. The legend of the 47 Ronin grew almost immediately, spreading through plays, poems, and popular retellings that simplified the moral ambiguities into a clear tale of loyalty triumphing over injustice. What endures is not the violence or the revenge itself, but the image of men who chose duty over survival, who waited patiently when patience seemed impossible, and who accepted death as the natural conclusion of their loyalty. In a modern world that often struggles to identify what, if anything, is worth sacrificing everything for, the 47 Ronin offer an uncomfortable answer. They believed loyalty to their lord mattered more than their own lives, and they proved that belief through actions rather than words. Whether that makes them heroes or cautionary tales remains a question each generation answers differently. But 3 centuries later, incense still burns at their graves, and their story still resonates with anyone who has ever wondered, what honor truly costs when the price is demanded in full.